thank you for joining us here at KVEC today. My name is Denny May, and I am joined by Dr. Dionne Bates. We are happy to have you. The topic today for the Principal Cadre Network is eligibility in special education. And at this time, I would like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Bates and let her give you a welcome.
We appreciate that you have taken the time to join us this morning. And our Principal Support Network has been designed. It's one that we offer quarterly for principals, and it's really designed just to help and assist principals with some of the big topics in special education. So this first one is going to be helping with eligibility. And it's very timely as we think about a lot of referrals. We're making determinations about students being eligible. We're looking at the MTSS and RTI process, and we're looking at supports for students. So again, this cadre meeting is just to continue to support you in the area of special education. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. May, and he'll get us started.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Bates. We appreciate that very much, and we appreciate all the support from the staff. Again, if you want to access the presentation, you can use the QR code to once again scan that code, and it will help you to access the presentation that we have, that you'll be seeing, and it'll give you all the resources and all the links that we have included. All right, without further ado, let's kind of get you moving a little bit this morning, and I just want you to look at this picture. I want you to look at actually look at the entire slide and just think about special education. And when special education works in your building best, it's when parents and families feel. And I'd like for you just to take a moment and think about that in the role that you're playing as an administrator, as a principal. And I would like you to just share some of your thoughts, if you don't mind. We have a small group today, so it certainly wouldn't be out of the way for you to unmute. But certainly if you don't want to do that and you don't want to speak, you could put your answer in the chat. So just take a minute or two, just a minute or two here. Don't want to take too much time, just to think about that question and reflect and write for us just a little bit. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and just quickly say that I think it works when parents and families feel included and heard and just a genuine part of the process.
I appreciate that. Mrs. Eversole, I really appreciate that. And that's exactly what the point of this slide is feeling invited to the school, invited to the table. We had the good fortune to get to hear Dr. John Hattie this summer, and he talked a lot about making sure that the entire classroom feels invited to the learning, and they feel included. And so certainly that is really what we're getting at here, and I appreciate that answer. Does anyone else want to share? We appreciate that very much.
Mr. May, we do have one in the chat. Amy Rhodes said, when parents and families feel heard and supported. Yes, when they
feel heard, you know, as far as leadership is concerned, one of the best attributes you can have as a leader is to truly listen and to hear what families have to say, and to work with them and to make them feel included is so super important. So today we are going to just kind of look at the referrals in special education. We're going to look at the application of eligibility criteria, and then we're going to suggest some tips around eligibility. So really want to kind of, just talk through, the acceptance of the referral, and then maybe, just a little work with you guys in terms of a session here to look at the criteria for eligibility and to understand and make connections about what the eligibility forms are saying and how that is operated within practice within your buildings. And so that's what we want to try to get to today. And so we'll continue on here. So we just wanted to throw this up here just as a good starting point. These are some absolutes, and we borrowed this from a really good book It's called what principals need to know about special education. And so, and then also some of our own impressions, but just quickly here, not all students needing classroom supports are in need of special education. There are a list of things that we can do before we refer. There's many strategies. There's many types of educational planning and systems that we can put into place. We have universal design for learning, differentiation, and then of course tiered activities. And we're going to talk a little bit in depth about that. And so, you know, the other piece that we would like you to consider is timelines are very important for your special education directors. When we talk about eligibility, especially initial eligibility, there's a 60-day school day timeline that goes with that. And then when you're talking about reevaluation, you have 36 months or 3 years to reevaluate students and to redetermine eligibility, if you will, at that time. So this whole idea of data-driven decision making is so important, and being in keeping in mind that we need time to develop these data sets, and there's timelines that go along with that. And this is an important one. You know, Federal Indicator 11 and the 60-day timeline for new referrals and initial evaluations is super vital because it's a federal indicator, and it goes a long way in continuing to have each district in a situation where they're compliant. Now, a parent should be included at every stage of the process. We know that from the Andrew case that super important to include parents, to have parents involved. We have to have parents consent. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And so, and then the other thing to remember here is if the student is not eligible, and we can determine that there is a disability, that the student's known to have a disability, and there's a major life activity being impaired by this disability, the student may be a candidate for a 504 plan. And so those are some of the things that we would consider. Now, when we look at this slide here, this is really just getting into the nuts and bolts of the special education cycle. And we're looking at just at the very top there, the intervention process. So like we said earlier, all students, including students with IEPs already, all students in that classroom need to feel included. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to exhaust our interventions. We need to make sure that before we go to referral, that we have completely exhausted the intervention process, and that we are sure that either by small group intervention or individualized intervention, tier 2, tier 3 interventions within that MTSS RTI process, that we've exhausted those, that we've looked at all the data from parents, that we've had conversations, and we've exhausted everything by starting to making sure core content has a strong element of universal design for learning, a strong element of differentiation that was started way back years ago by Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson. And so we need to make sure that as principals, we can look at those situations and say, hey, we see this going on in our core instruction. Our core instruction's strong. We've got elements of inclusion in every corner of the room. And then after a concerted effort to provide intervention at either tier 2 or tier 3, and then also knowing what the rate of improvement is within your district that's expected, and comparing those students to what's expected either by the industry standards that are out there or the work within the Kentucky academic standards. We need to just think about intervention and make sure that we have exhausted all that before we move to referral. And then once we move to referral, then we certainly are going to look as the principal, it's going to be very important that we, or as the chairperson, that we're able to look at that referral and determine if the intervention strategies are properly documented. And that's so super important. And at that point, you know, with the referral, if we've documented the proper amount of intervention, if we have interventions that are research based, that have been peer reviewed, that have some evidence based to them that they actually work, and this is what we would do for a student with this type of problem in many cases, then as we look at that, we just need to make sure that we have applied that in the proper way. And then we can say, okay, we think that this student certainly presents as a student that has a suspected disability. And then at that point, we would start to look at eligibility. Now, obviously, once a student is determined eligible, then we have 10 days to develop an IEP. And the way we do things in this region, we typically have that eligibility meeting and that IEP meeting together. However, I would caution you to think about not predetermining things for students, not predetermining eligibility, not predetermining that the student's going to have an IEP. It's okay to have a draft, and it's okay to have conversations, but it's certainly we would caution you there. And then, of course, you know, placement. We're not going to predetermine placement. The needs on the IEP are going to determine the placement and where the students receive the services. And then, of course, the instruction. It needs to continue to include RTI and MTSS. It needs to continue to include UDL differentiation, and then also specially designed instruction that is intentional toward the goals that are on the IEP. And then, of course, we get to the point that after 1 year, we have to have an annual review. We have to look at those progress monitoring pieces, and we have to determine, we're really, in a sense, redetermining eligibility, because we need to show that the student is still in need of specially designed instruction. They still have an adverse effect. So we're going to talk more in depth about that. Okay, so what we have here is just a screenshot. Dr. Bates has been working quite a bit in the area of referral with districts and doing a lot of really good training. So I'm just going to open it up to her if she wants to say something here. Certainly love to hear what she has to say about just this screen.
All right. Thank you, Mr. May. A couple of things I want to just reiterate. You talked about some of the things that either we have to do prior to or as part of that referral process for special education. We have to make sure, and this is governed by our expectations with special education law and our Kentucky administrative regulations. But we have to make sure that a child has an appropriate, relevant, research-based instruction and intervention provided by a qualified professional. And we also have to have that data collection at reasonable intervals, and then communicate those results with parents along the way. So on this screen, you'll see that we have an example of a referral, and this is just an example. But it has been really kind of developed from some actual referrals that we have across the region. It's kind of a compilation of multiple ones. But the referral process, we talk about, the demographic data, but then we get into that summary of intervention data. And you can see, for example, on the screen, the smaller square up in the top right-hand corner, it says summary of intervention data. We're talking about what is the area that we're focusing on for that referral. And it's really important that we capture that, because it goes back to that, we're identifying the area and we're choosing research-based strategies. And so you can see in our example on the screen, we have reading and math, right? So we start thinking about our student presents with, they're behind, maybe they're lower on the benchmark assessment. We're noticing that in the classroom, they're not performing at the rate of their peers. And so we start to suspect that there's a disability, and then we move them from tier 1 to, we start thinking about, what are we going to do in that tier 1 setting? What are some of those things that we're doing in that regular ed setting? And then, so we're providing those interventions. And so what our teachers are having the most trouble with is identifying what those evidence-based interventions are in that tier 1 setting, and what supports they're giving them, and then what they're doing in tier 2. And so if you'll look at number 3 on that screen, and it says, describe the tiered interventions implemented in the general ed classroom. And you'll see that In this particular case, we say all tier 1 interventions, we're using decoding, reading comprehension, writing and modeling, math computation, and math reasoning. So those are what in this referral we're saying is the areas that we're providing the interventions. And you'll see down below that what the beginning and end dates of those are. And so we look at how did the student do along with those interventions. And so that one is probably about a 10-week period of time. And we're saying that every day for 30 minutes that we provided all of those things for students. And then we measured the impact. And all the impact on this example is that 30% accuracy for grade level comprehension. So really the only data that we're demonstrating here is that we don't really see the data points. We only know that the student scored 30% on reading comprehension. And so sometimes we have a lot of those interventions listed, but those are general statements, not necessarily evidence-based interventions. And it may be a bit difficult for us to see them. But what we're saying there is we're just choosing a lot of different things that we think could be a strategy to help that student in those areas. But we're talking about on this one, we're saying we're going to work with students on decoding. We're going to help them with reading comprehension. We're helping them with writing and math. And so is that the area that we think that they need support in? And then if you'll look, we move to tier 2, and then we move to tier 3 is in that bottom right-hand example. And so you can see again, what happened was we just took that same piece of information and we copied that and moved it down to the tier 2, right? So you're still saying you're doing all the tier 2 interventions, you're working on comprehension, you're working on all of those skills. But what that does not tell us is what is that skill that we're working on with those students, and what is the evidence-based instructional strategy we're using as a teacher. So as you're evaluating and reviewing referral documents for those referral meetings, this is the piece that's missing a lot of the times, is the data and the evidence-based intervention that were delivered to students. So, that's a look for. What should those be? And if we know that there's a specific skill or there's a skill deficit of a student, that should be what we're seeing in those blocks. It should be, if it's decoding, then we're using, some kind of structured, systematic phonics instruction, and we're delivering that every day. And you can also look at the amount of time, because if you look in that bottom example, we're saying that we're doing that 60 minutes. So we're saying that we're providing that intervention 60 minutes in addition to the 30 minutes a day. So we would be at 90 minutes. And so there's a discrepancy between those. But again, part of that referral process is really making sure that we have the data to substantiate why we suspect that there's a disability.
Certainly, that's a real good description of what's going on here. And I just point out a couple of things. One, do we know where I would question where did the interventions come from? Can we verify? Do we know? And have we been in the classrooms as principals during our walkthrough time or whatever we do in terms of supervision there? Are we looking at those RTI times, and are we seeing something more than having students maybe just placed on a computer-based program? Is there truly instruction going on? And are they gathering data? How can they tell if the student made progress or didn't? And that's really, really important. So those are the kinds of things that we want to see on the referral. And this is where I feel like when we review files within our region, it really seems to kind of fall off the table a little bit as to how much documentation we put in that referral to really say that the students had the proper experiences, the students had the interventions, and we can truly say that they've not responded and they've not made the progress that's expected. So we have to identify what the rate of expected progress is, and we have to say, hey, we're sure now this student is not responding. This student is not giving us. They're not growing, and they're not growing at tier 3. And I would say too, your tier 3 intervention program should look a lot like, those first services that are provided on the special education side of things after a student is found to be eligible. Do we have intentionality? Have we increased the number of practice turns and feedback that we give students? do we know for sure that we're providing the students with what needs to be provided, and it's something that works? So that's really, really important in terms of the referral process. And so that would be, I would think, a number one responsibility when you enter into this referral process as the chairperson, as the leader in the school, that you're able to look at that document and say, you know what, this doesn't meet the mark, or it does meet the mark. Can you tell me how much progress this kid's made, and how many data points have we provided, and how many probes have we taken, and how many times can we say that the student has not met what we expected, and is that really definitively telling us that we should suspect a disability, and then do some further individualized examination. This is just really quickly, just kind of what we talked about just now. So I just wanted to throw this in here. How do we find tiered interventions? Are the interventions evidence-based? Are staff able to implement tiered strategies? Are we talking about just using a program, or are we really talking about intensified instruction? And are we gathering data on how students do within those time periods? And is there a problem-solving team around this to look at this data and to discuss this data and to say this student needs to move from this tier to this tier? Do we have those? And you know, can we help to build capacity within our buildings so that teachers become more adept at being able to provide interventions, and to, because it's, I mean, it's really the reality of where we are now, is that the classroom, you know, is full of students that need support. And so we just need to continue to think about that. But anyway, just looking at the tier, you know, just understanding universal supports are for all students in tier 1, and that we're going to go targeted intervention classroom, and then intensive services as we move up that tier. And the whole idea of this triangle is that those groups become smaller. Your tier 1 is going to have a larger sample size than your tier 3. And certainly we need to think about those things, but just collaborating and understanding and working with, building capacity within those classrooms to have teachers to have those abilities to provide strategies that work is super, super important. And, you know, I would challenge each of us to think about, are we truly doing what we need to be doing for students with disabilities if we haven't ruled all of these things out first before we call them disabled? So super important. And I would also ask you to think, you know, I have children. If it were my child, would I want everything exhausted? And then that's kind of what we have to do. We, you know, there's this phrase, Latin phrase, in loco parentis, and we're in the place of parents in those classrooms and in those buildings, and we're taking care of these children. And so we want to do everything we can to help flush those problems out and to be able to determine and pinpoint what exactly the student needs. So here, as we move into the eligibility piece, if we go through that referral and we have that meeting, that referral, and we say, okay, what's the next steps? The next steps are to gain consent, and to target the areas within which we are going to evaluate. And the whole key here is to make sure that we do a comprehensive evaluation, that we hit all the areas of concern. And so what you see here is a consent to evaluate. It's super important that we don't do any individualized evaluations before we have consent, and it's dated and signed by that parent. So we need to verify that as the principal. And then we need to look at this evaluation planning form and make sure that we have the pieces. You know, in general, in lots of times you're going to have a cognitive assessment under the general intelligence piece. And under the academic performance, we're going to test things like reading, math, and written expression in general. Okay. And then we're going to ask for an adaptive behavior. Lots of times we use the Vineland in this region, and some districts use the ABOS, but certainly we would just need to eyeball that and say, okay, the things on the referral that were exposed need to be evaluated because now we're suspecting a disability. We've got consent from the parent. And then, you know, we just need to make sure that those are being followed through with, so that we're following through with the evaluation of the student in the areas they need to be evaluated in. So just to kind of recap here, we got the response to intervention piece. I think the big takeaway is that we need to look at that data. That's where that separates a really good referral from one that is lacking is that we know how to look at that RTI. We know that that's been provided with fidelity. We know that the numbers are showing that the student hasn't made progress, and we can suspect a disability. And then once we get to the referral process, that we review all that information and we determine what evaluations need to be made. And then when we look at that initial evaluation, a comprehensive evaluation is conducted to assist in determining if the student has a disability. That's what we're trying to do. And then, of course, we've mentioned the timeline, that 60-day timeline. Just some steps to determine eligibility, just some things to think about here. Upon analysis of intervention assessment, the ARC shall determine whether the child is a child with a disability. And the key words here are analysis, child, and disability. We want to put the focus on the child. We want to make sure that we are doing the proper intervention and that the assessment data matches the needs of the student. And so that's certainly one piece that we would think about. And then making eligibility determinations, an LEA shall draw upon information from a variety of sources. When we do the evaluation, the rule of thumb is to provide a multidisciplinary evaluation report. And so we need to be able to look at those reports and determine first, did we get all the information back that we asked for? Does the report match the evaluation planning form? You remember that form that I just showed you right here? Does the information in the report match what we asked? And so we need to have somebody gatekeeping and making sure that we're getting all the information, because if it's incomplete, we can't proceed. And it's super important to act on these things quickly. And I know that our districts are having some trouble with psychologists not being available. And so that's something we need to think, okay, we need to get on these things and get our work done on our end as quickly as possible in our schools. So you can encourage your teachers, hey, do you have the behavioral observations? As we look back to some of those things that we would look at, you would see behavioral observations. So some of those things that go into that report are things that we can get done quickly. We can do the social developmental history. We can do the adaptive behavior assessment. We can do the rating scales if needed. And we can do that, make sure that we have tremendous classroom-based observations and performance data that's going to help us make that decision, because this is going to be it's going to be a comprehensive determination of eligibility. And there's lots of pieces that we look to, and we're not going to just use one piece of a source. So within that multidisciplinary evaluation report, you're going to have academic achievement measures. You're going to have IQ measures. You're going to have adaptive measures. You're going to have some behavioral observations. You may have some rating scales, depending on the disability that is selected. So certainly that's something to think about. Another thing that we can't overlook is parent input. And one of the rules of thumb, and one of the things that you guys need to know, is that when parents bring in outside information, we have to consider that as the ARC. When we're in that ARC meeting, we have to consider that. Now, do we have to accept it and use it? Not always, but we need to go through it, analyze it, and see if it fits the things that we're doing on our side. So, sometimes we get into a situation where we have a parent referral and they bring information to us. We need to pause right there and say, you know what, we're going to accept the parent referral. We can't delay it. We're going to look at our RTI process. We're going to look at our classroom-based observations, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to do a lot of the evaluation on our side if we accept the referral, and we're going to compare how that matches up with the outside data. And certainly it's okay to use it, but it wouldn't be the only source of data that you would use to determine eligibility. So those are some things that we need to think about. So consider that information provided by parents, and make sure that the parents are afforded the opportunity for meaningful input, and that you're not making these decisions devoid of the parent and the parent input. So again, just the overall overview of this is that we need to make sure that we've tested all the areas that we asked for, and that before we go to the table, we've looked at that psychological report. A best practice is to also share that psychological report with that parent to give them time to prepare, especially if it's an initial referral. So I know in the real world, we have trouble getting reports back in a timely fashion. So the other recommendation would be to include or encourage your staff to include and get all this information on the school side ready in a timely fashion, and not to waste any time in regards to that, because getting that IQ seems to be very difficult these days in some places. So we want to make you aware of that. We know that there are some districts where they have several psychologists on staff, and that's so super nice when you have that. But when we're contracting, sometimes we lack our control of that. And an LAA shall ensure the information obtained from these sources are appropriate for each student, that they're documented and they're carefully considered. Now, some of these things that we're putting up here on the screen come straight out of the Kentucky Administrative Regulations. So we're not just telling you these are things that we think or we believe. And while certainly we do think them and believe them, they're rooted in the law. And so we need to make sure that we're following the law, because this is an area within schools that's very potentially litigious, and people can get into trouble over this. But down here at the bottom, you got that picture, and you can see that the eligibility is not standing on one leg. It's standing on multiple legs. And what that's representative of is that we can't use a single procedure to determine eligibility. And what comes to mind there is IQ scores. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll look at that a little further as we get into the presentation. But this says just a single procedure shall not, and I don't know about you guys, but I went to church pretty much all my life, and shall means you will do it. There's no in between. There's no gray area. It's black and white. Shall means you will do it. So the single procedure shall not be used as the sole criterion for determining whether a child is a child with a disability. So that comprehensive look at that child is what we need to be thinking about when we're making eligibility determinations. In order to be eligible for special education in Kentucky, we have a three-pronged approach to eligibility. We need to be aware of this, okay? Not only do we meet the criteria that's set forth in the eligibility form, we have to document the adverse effect from the disability. And then we have to show that the student needs something more than tiered intervention, something more than UDL, something more than differentiation. They need specially designed instruction. They need more practice turns and feedback. They need more probing. They need more broken down instruction. They need modeling. They need practice. They need feedback. They need formative assessment, and they need it more frequently. Okay, and so we really need to think about, is that really based on the adverse effect? And then the way we determine adverse effect is the law says that the student needs to be shown to be significantly and consistently below their similar age peer. And so sometimes that can be a score, or sometimes that can be an anecdote, or sometimes that can be, some qualitative data that we would put into like a behavioral observation. So we need to look at all of that to make that determination on adverse effect. Can we see an adverse effect from the student having ADHD? Can we see an adverse effect from the student's vision impairment? Those types of things. So how far are we away? How far is the student away from what's expected at that similar age peer that is making good grades, progressing through the system, and making progress that's expected? So now I just wanted to ask you a question. Where do we make this determination about eligibility? Where would we make this determination as a school about this three-pronged approach? And where would we talk about this? And where would we document it? We're going to do this in the ARC meeting. It seems straightforward, but sometimes we lack, and one of your roles as a principal is to make sure that documentation is followed through, that due process followed. And one of the due process pieces is to make sure that we've documented all this in the minutes, that we've discussed that we looked at the eligibility form, we determined the adverse effect, and we determine the need for specially designed instruction. And we do that every year, really, in annual review, but we certainly do it on that initial one, and we do it at reevaluation. All right, let's move on here. So we're getting into just talking about determining eligibility. We have this bell curve that we want to talk about just a little bit. And I think it helps us to visualize. I'm a visual learner. And so I think it just helps to see sometimes what it looks like on a normal distribution curve here, where you would have an equal number of people on the right side of 100 and an equal number of people on the left side of 100. And so when we think about looking at psychological reports, lots of times you'll get a standard score number. Okay, your IQ will be represented by an overall standard score. So you'll have an overall IQ of maybe 70. Okay, or you'll have an IQ of 55, or you'll have an IQ of 98. And that we're looking at that full scale score. And then we're going to see what, how that full scale score impacts. And does it create a situation where there's an adverse effect? Does it create a situation where the student's going to need specially designed instruction? And so when we look at that first one, we look at SLD there. And lots of times our students that are SLD will have an IQ score that's in the average range. They'll be somewhere in that 92 range, or they'll be 96, or they'll be even up there at 102 or 104. And then when we look at their academic achievement, which also in that report, in that psychological report, we'll see that there's academic achievement standard scores, and we can compare those two. And so that's how we determine specific learning disability. And then as we move on to the left, we have one there that's DD. Now, the psychologists know about this, and a lot of you know about this because you've had to study it. There is this manual called the DSM 5, I think it is now, that we work with. And the DSM 5 considers people to be significantly consistently below same age peers when they start to show scores like academic scores, or maybe motor scores, or communication scores that are 77.5 and below. Okay, so when we look at the developmental delay category, we're looking for scores that are 77.5 or below. We're either needing a score that's 2 standard deviations below the mean, or 2 scores that are 77.5 below the mean. And so, that's just one way of quickly thinking about what's in that criteria. Now, we're talking about IQ scores here, and we're talking about comparing IQ scores to academic achievement scores for LD, and we're looking at the areas of development, those 5 areas of development in developmental delay. Now, when we move down to the intellectual disabilities, we're looking for a score of 70 for MMD and not lower than 56. When you hit 55, then we're looking at a functional mental disability as opposed to a mild mental disability. So as you see at the bottom, these tests are arranged by standard deviations, and the standard deviation is 15 for these tests. And so on a normal distribution, what this is saying is most of the people that take the IQ test, most of the people that take the achievement test, most of people that are administered the Vinelands and the adaptive behavior measures, or the measures in motor development or communication, most of the people fall within that 100, or within that range between 85 and 115, which we consider the average range. And so lots of times when students are in the average range across the board, there's probably not a great likelihood that they're going to be qualifying for special education. But it's when we compare those scores to other areas, or we have outline scores, or we have scores that are consistently either a standard and a half or 2 standard deviations below the mean, that we start to see those disabilities emerge with fidelity. I think this is just a good way of visually taking a look at what's coming, which is those eligibility determinations. So the first one we're going to look at in way of practicing is we want you to look at some anecdotal information that we provided on the next slide, and we want you to focus on the cognitive functioning piece and the adaptive. So you can see that in the bar there inside that or inside that box that we've placed around on the left-hand side of the screen under the mild mental disability form. This is what the form looks like. And of course, there's a lot to this form, but one of the first things we have to do is we have to verify if we're suspecting a mild mental disability with the student, do we know what the student's cognitive functioning is, and do we know what the adaptive behavior is? So we can go onto this screen and we can look at this first example, and we really need you to participate here, okay? We really need you to read through this information and then place your answer in the chat box, or you can unmute and talk to us. Think about this, and we're looking at, going back, let's go back here just a second. We're looking at the cognitive functioning and the adaptive behavior. And the question is, did the student have scores that are at least 2 standard deviations below the mean? The mean being 100, the standard deviation being 15. And now we're going to go to the slide that has the information. Okay. And so just give us a report of the scores that are notable that would answer these questions. So the question is, are these in a range? Because what it says on 1A is, does the student present with a cognitive functioning that is 2 standard deviations below the mean? So that would be the question. Is 68 a yes? And then is 63 a yes for the adaptive? Because it asks for the same thing, 2 standard deviations below the mean, with the standard deviation being 15. So 2 standard deviations would be 30 points. She's below on both. That's exactly right. And that's a start for us. Okay. That's what we want to say. It's a start for us to see these 2 scores be yes. Okay. And then we have to do some other work. We have to triangulate some data. We have to look at behavioral observations. Remember all those sources that we said we might look at? We have to look at how they're doing in the classroom, what their grades are, how far they are behind, those types of things. So we're looking at a holistic approach, but certainly this goes a long way in determining eligibility. All right. So let's go back to this. So we would check the box yes, because it was the 68 puts us 2 standard deviations, but it's not more than 3 standard deviations. 3 standard deviations would be 55. So we're between that score of 70 and 56. And so we would mark that as a yes. And then the adaptive behavior is at least 2 standard deviations below the mean. Now, as you go on down through there, you're also going to look at, is there a deficit that exists in overall academic performance? So we would look for similar scores across the board in reading, math, and writing. And the question might beg itself here, if you have an outlier score like an 80 on maybe a reading fluency, but all the other scores are in the 60s and 70s, it's okay to have an outlier score occasionally in those areas. Some kids have areas of strength, and we would look for those when we develop the IEP. We would look for those outlier scores. If they're positively skewed, we would say, hey, that 80 is definitely, that reading fluency is something we can build on. And then the other piece, it says, is this, I think I've got a slide here that talks about this. Let's go on to it, and we'll come back to the other practice. So it says the full scale scores of 70 or below between 56, and we'd be looking at the WISC-5. Lots of times that's the IQ test that we give, and then the adaptive behaviors, 2 standard deviations below the mean. So it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 56. And then the wide achievement scores, we're going to look at, like I said, we're going to look at those scores. And then the developmental period is anything that emerges or manifests itself during that typical period between birth and age 18 in the state of Kentucky. And then we look to see, did they have the proper experiences in reading and math? Okay. Is our core instruction strong? Number 1. Number 2, did the kid attend school consistently? Is attendance a problem? And have they been in school? We had a period back there a few years ago with the pandemic where students were in virtual school, and it was hard to say that they had receive the proper instruction in reading and math. It was just really hard. It was just a really hard time for us, and it was an area of growth for us. And meetings like this emerged from that. So I think it's been a good thing in some ways, but at the same time, it's hard to verify the lack of instruction in reading and math is not a determinant factor. So we have to rule that out. That's a rule out factor, okay? And then the other is that the student, if they are limited English proficiency, that would not be a factor in the eligibility determination. So that's something we wanted to look at. And then, evaluation information then determines down there at the bottom, it says we use multiple sources to triangulate the data and substantiate the existence of the disability. Down at the bottom of the screen there, you have to read the fine print, right? And we confirm the progress of the student is impeded by the disability to the extent the student's educational performance is significantly and consistently below same age peers. And so we would look at these things. We look at classroom performance examples. We look at district assessments, MAP, CERT, IXL, grades, MTSS and RTI data, and state test results to help us make this decision. And we would document this all on the second page under supporting evidence. And we would look at the lack of instruction in reading, and we've kind of already gone through that. And then, of course, the limited proficiency. So those are all pieces. Now, let's go back and practice one more. We've got another one here, and we would like for you to do the same thing. Just read through the information and see if you can determine, based on the report here, based on the report, or based on the form, does this student have the numbers that they need to answer the questions yes or no in those first two boxes, so that we can proceed with developing the rest of the triangulation of data? No to both. No to both, because you can see pretty clearly here, that the student has a full scale IQ of 74. So, and the adaptive behavior score is 73. Now, we're just going to go ahead and say, this is an initial, okay? This is an initial. Anything that would draw any kind of question here as to whether or not this student is a student that's going to qualify for mild mental disability. Initially, we'd probably say no, that the student's not going to do that. Now, let's talk about the full scale IQ score and the adaptive score. There is some standard error of measure. Anytime, can you ever use the universal screeners that are consistently low to help determine these decisions? You would certainly look at that information, but that wouldn't, that would be a piece of it, because that's part of the way the student is performing in the classroom. So you could look at MAP scores as a piece, but what you're doing is you're trying to build a consistent case. So when you look at those scores, do those support that low IQ or lower IQ, or that IQ that's in those two standard deviation range? Now, to go on a little bit further, and I don't want to blow your mind, we were about to talk about standard error of measurement. Anytime you do any type of sampling of groups, you can't get an exact. You're not going to get an exact yes or an exact no when it comes to statistics. And so build into this confidence interval and build into the scores here, there's a standard error of measurement. So what the standard error of measurement by rule of thumb, now you need your psychologist to help you with this kind of thing. You would call them in, but we've kind of used the rule of thumb. If one of the scores, the full either the full scale IQ, let's say the full scale IQ is not 74, it's 73, but the adaptive behavior is also 73. Well, you can't use both. You can't apply the standard error of measurement to both to make the student eligible. Now, if you apply the standard error of measurement to the full scale, and the full scale is 73, and the Vineland score, the adaptive behavior scores, 2 standard deviations below the mean, then you could check those boxes as yes using that standard error of measurement, and you would explain that in your supporting evidence, and you would explain that in your eligibility decision in your conference summary minutes. So the 73 sometimes can be applied to either of the full scale or the adaptive behavior. Now, Now, remember, we talked about not using one score to knock or include, to knock a student from being receiving services, or to have a student receive services. So we don't want to base it on just one score. We have to put that whole picture together, including what you were talking about, those universal screeners that are a big start for us. And then of course the progress we do within the MTSS program.
I just wanted to talk about something clarifying there,
Okay.
Mr. May. We were back, if you don't mind, just go back to that previous slide.
Okay, yes.
We're talking about that full scale IQ and the adaptive behavior. How do we know that those are the two measures that we're looking at predominantly for that eligibility?
How do we know that those
Yeah,
are
how do we know that we're using the IQ and the adaptive behavior score? Where does that
Well,
come from?
it comes from right there. It
That
kind
right.
in the box, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe I wasn't very clear because, you know, it says clearly here that the ARC compared and analyzed evaluation data and the documents in the following interpretation. We have to look at the cognitive piece. We have to look at the WISC score in the psychological report, and we have to determine if the full scale is 2 standard deviations below the mean in general. Okay, there's always exceptions to every rule, right? And in general, we need to look at the Vineland or the ABOS. Those are the 2 most widely used within our region. And mostly it's the Vineland, okay? And we look and we say, okay, is it 2 standard deviations below the mean? And then to confuse the water, I throw in standard error of measurement. Sometimes you can use a 73, but you can only use it on one of those 2 pieces. You can't use it on both. Does that help clear up some of the confusion?
Yeah, I think so. I think that will help them just kind of make sure that we're looking at those. Those are some critical pieces of data that we use in that eligibility determination. Because I
Sure.
think it's sometimes confusing when we think about all the multiple pieces of data, but those are part of our evaluation and our report. So that governs or kind of guides our thinking about where, when we consider eligibility.
I kind of think about it like this. If I'm going to use a score that's in that borderline range, I've got to have some strong pieces from that classroom. I've got to have some strong observation information. I've got to have some strong information from the parent. I've got to have some strong data that builds that case. Okay. I don't want to stand on one score ever, because the law says we can't do that. And we can't exclude either by standing on one score, just like we can't include. So I think that's very, very important as we move forward in our thinking. It's just really, really difficult to have a score in a gray area and not have supporting pieces. You're on dangerous ground there legally, I think. Okay. Now, going back to our bell curve, we're gonna just talk about one that's a little more difficult sometimes to determine. As a matter of fact, there's an entire specific learning disability guidance document that is really, I mean, if you're working with those types of eligibilities, it's really good to review that. And so one of the biggest questions about specific learning disability is, are we going to use the discrepancy model, or are we going to use RTI as a way of determining eligibility? And in our region, we use the discrepancy model without fail. We've kind of gone back and forth. There's some opportunity to choose and that type of thing. And clearly, if you're in that situation where your policies and procedures allow you to choose, you need to determine that up front when you're doing your suspected disability. You need to document that in your evaluation planning, and you can't jump back and forth between the 2 and have eligibility emerge from that jumping back and forth between the RTI or MTSS method and the discrepancy model. So we're going to talk about the discrepancy model because that's what we use more consistently than any other. And so let's look at, all right, so here is the SLD at a glance. And you see in the first box, the student is provided with learning experiences and instruction appropriate for the student's age and state-approved grade level standards. Okay, again, you're going to do a survey. Is my tier 1 strong? Did the student have the chance to have the proper experiences in reading and math? Has the student attended school consistently? And, we're getting into an era where there's laws being passed about attendance and that type of thing. But we don't need to rule out students because of attendance entirely, but we need to discuss that, and we need to apply good common sense when it comes to, has the student been in school enough? Has the student received the services? Have they been through the intense phonics program? Has the student had a chance before we jump into that? And that's very clearly stated here in the first box. And then we have to choose which method. And like I said, we're going to work with the severe discrepancy. Now, going back to our bell curve, and just turn away from the screen for a second. I'll go back to the bell curve there. The SLD category, typically you're going to look and you're going to find an IQ, a WISC score that's going to be in the average range. It's going to be 88, 92, 96, 98, 102. And then you're going to have academic achievement scores that fall well below that. And the rule of thumb is 22 points. Now, we don't just apply 22 points. We have tables and we have things that psychologists do for us that tell us, yes, that there's a severe discrepancy in reading or reading fluency or reading comprehension or math reasoning, math calculation, or writing. Okay. They'll look at those areas and they'll say the scores in those achievement areas are 22 points or more lower. But that's a rule of thumb. Okay. We have a table based on their student's age that we have to apply before we determine that. And so that's in the report, and it will say you'll have that comparison, and you'll have that criterion score, and those achievement scores have to be equal to or lower than that criterion score. And then out from that, it'll say yes or no. So they kind of do that work for you. So we didn't feel like in this instance, we needed to dive deeply into that, but we need a rudimentary understanding of the SLD process. So we're looking at higher IQ scores and lower achievement scores. And we use that 20, if you look at those scores and you say, okay, we see there's a higher IQ here than, the kid's in the average range IQ. So that's his potential for learning, but his achievement and his actual performance is much lower than expected. So what's going on here? We might have a problem where the student does in fact have a specific learning disability. Now we're going to go back to the form, and we're going to see that just what we said. We're looking for the student does not achieve adequately as indicated on multiple data sources for the student's age or grade level standards. So we need to verify that they're consistently and significantly below their same age peers, just like we did on the other. But this is a comparison. We're looking at IQ, expected performance, what's the potential for that student's learning, and what their actual learning is in those areas. And we compare that. And then we go a little deeper and we triangulate the data just like we did in the other. We would use the classroom observations. We would use the state and district test. We would use the behavioral observation. I said behavioral observations already. We would use all of those pieces that we talked about, those sources of data that would help us in determining whether or not the student presents as someone that has an adverse effect and that needs specially designed instruction. Okay. Let me say something about that right quick while I'm thinking about it before we get off here. If the student has a disability that's documented, and we know that that student has that disability, and we look at the SLD and they don't meet, okay, they don't have a discrepancy that's large enough, that student may in fact be eligible for other programs. Like you could think, does the student need some support accommodation wise? Because when you have a known impairment that's impacting learning, you could fall into that 504 category. Okay. Now, sometimes, that's a little bit controversial. Some districts do that. Some districts don't, but certainly we want to reiterate the point that when you have a student with an IEP, that student has the civil right to receive specially designed instruction. But then when you also see that that student has access or 504 protection, and so they get accommodations. But now some students just need accommodations, and that takes care of the problem, and they go back to being a little closer and a little closer, and they start to progress, and they matriculate through the grades, and that's all they need. So this SLD at a glance is just a really quick go over of what we look at. We look at IQ scores that are in the average range, and we look at achievement scores that are somewhat lower and fall into those ranges that are at least a standard and a half deviation below the mean. So it's your turn. Take a look at this and just tell us what are the key pieces that you would pull away from this screen, and just based on what we've discussed, does it appear that this child might be a candidate for a specific learning disability determination? One of the things I notice immediately when I read this is he's in the 4th grade and his scores are in the 2nd grade level. That's one of the things I would look at. And then what else would I look? What else would you look at there as considering this student's specific learning disability? The IQ is in the average range. Yes, it's in the average range. So that's a start. And then we would compare that average range to those lower, significantly below average scores in reading. We have a spelling score on here that goes under written expression. So you wouldn't use, you would look at the overall written expression scores. You wouldn't use just the spelling subtest score, but you could use the reading score here, and you would hone in on whether or not that was basic reading or whether that was reading fluency or reading comprehension. Spelling certainly can have an impact because it goes hand in hand with learning to read, and writing also goes hand in hand with that. But we would focus in on probably the 105 and the 78. Okay, so here's another one. When we look at OHI here, it's a little bit different. OHI really leans on rating scales. It leans on, sometimes we get a doctor's diagnosis. Now we can't require a doctor's diagnosis in the state of Kentucky for eligibility, but we certainly like to have those if we can get them, right? And so that's an outside source, right? But we still have some work to do under other health impairment. And so it says there's an existence of a health impairment that's caused by a chronic or an acute health problem. And it can be any of those things. And one of the big ones that we always have to consider within school is ADD, attention deficit disorder. And so we would want to do some rating scales on our side. We would want to do things like the Connors, and we would want to do behavioral observations. And then we would want to look to see if there was an adverse effect on the educational performance. And one way we can go back, you know, a lot of times these OHI students will be somewhere in this average range. Maybe they might be 88 or 90. But then, you know, their attention has caused them difficulties in reading, or we're not real sure which comes first. But we just kind of have to flush that out and see if that attention problem is having impact in other areas. So in order to make a student eligible, we need to verify that they have clinically significant ranges of attention deficit, and we need behavioral observations to support it. We need those rating scales to support it. We need any diagnosis that we can get from the parent. But then we also look at those scores and we see, are there any test scores, any academic achievement scores that are 77.5 or below? Or do we have any classroom data and classroom performance data that says that that student is not up to speed in those areas? Is there an adverse effect from the disability? And the law says that we treat anything that emanates from that disability. So we want to make sure that that 77.5 is, we're looking at like, okay, is there a reading fluency score that's 75 or 72? That student would also not only be a candidate for goals to work on the behaviors of being off task or the attention problem, but we would also work on the academics. So we look at that adverse effect. How's that adverse effect keeping us from completing tasks? How's that adverse effect keeping us from getting our schoolwork done? How's that adverse effect making us fail a course? How's that adverse effect really, really impacting the student to a degree that they're significantly and consistently below same age peers? They don't just need extended time. If they need just extended time and that takes care of it, they're a 504 candidate. But if they really have a severe attention deficit and we're starting to see adverse effect branch out into other areas and cause them problems across the board in school, then we know that that candidate's more likely to be a candidate with a disability that needs specially designed instruction. Do we need to do specially designed instruction to help them with reading? Do we need to do specially designed instruction to help them with behavior? On task behavior, task completion, executive functioning kinds of things. Can they plan? Can they follow through? Can they manage their impulses? Those types of things. So we would look at all of that information and put that together in that supporting evidence piece that we continue to look at, because we always have to have that triangulation of data. This page right here that we're seeing on the screen, the OHI, also has a second page that has supporting evidence. They all have supporting evidence pages where you have to build that out. And when you flush out triangulated data, the connection to the SDI, the specially designed instruction, and providing the proper instruction for students is has a greater probability. Okay, so is it important? Yes, it's important that we go through this and we do it with fidelity. Is our core instruction being completed with fidelity? Can you identify and implement research-based strategies? Have students had the proper experiences in reading and math and behavior? Are parents involved in the decisions? These are just some kind of the takeaways for our eligibility practices. And if those are not going on in your schools, you need to take a step forward and see that these types of things are being completed and done. Do you have district level teams that can really, really look at this data and break this data down and make sure that we can pinpoint the problems and we make a connection between disability and specially designed instruction? The need for specially designed instruction, the adverse effect, and the criteria all go together to create eligibility for special education. If you have one of those pieces missing, then it's incomplete and the student's not eligible. Kind of put this together, just kind of looking at some of these higher incidence categories and just looking at some things to think about, like intellectual disability. We have to look at the IQ. We have to look at the adaptive, and then the use of the standard error of measurement, and whether or not we're doing these measures with fidelity. Okay. And you can look through that section there. See, with the ADHD diagnosis, is there a doctor's diagnosis? And what's the impact on in-school performance? That's not enough. It can't just have a diagnosis. You have to verify that there's an adverse effect on educational performance, that those attentions and those behaviors are causing the problem. Of course, non-discriminatory evaluation is part of the IDEA law. So we need to make sure that it's given in the native language, it's appropriate for age and suspected disability. The trained evaluators are people that can give IQ, that they're certified to give IQ tests, because that's a different certification. We don't base eligibility on one test result. We must test all areas suspected, team decisions, not a single individual score that's going to make us or break us, and we meet eligibility criteria. Put this in as well. This is the IQ test crosswalk. So if you have these 5 areas, when you get that psychological report, you're going to have these 5 areas, and you're going to have subtests that are done. But look at the skills assessed, the impact, and the supports. Those last 3 columns really make those IQ scores real for us. So if you have working memory issues, what can we do to support that SDI and support that student? So that's why we included that for you. And I love this crosswalk because it helps us to flush out those 5 pieces that really impact that student's disability and their performance. So are we applying the discrepancy model correctly? That's the SLD model, right? That's where we look at the high achievement score, the high high IQ score, and compare it to the achievement scores that are lower. Do we have people that are like you principals that are really being a gatekeeper? Are we looking hard at the triangulated data and making sure that we have a strong case for eligibility? Can we reevaluate and correct any inconsistencies? And do the ARC minutes capture eligibility discussion? So those are all things as principals we need to be verifying. Through this little piece in here, you can see some incidence rates, the high incidence disability categories, and you can see the low incidence disability categories. Why it's important to really have strong core instructions, strong tiered instruction, and strong co-teaching models, because 60% of our students with disabilities are spending about 80% of their day in general education. And we need to make sure that co-teaching models and teams are aware of all the strategies, and that those strategies and pieces are being provided with fidelity so that all students have a chance to progress. We see that a national number for special education, almost 67% are boys in across the nation, and 33% are girls. We really appreciate you being here with us today. Turn it back over to Dr. Bates. Close up.
Oh, thank you, Mr. May. That was just perfect. So thank you all for hanging with us today. We appreciate you being here. Hopefully you are able to take away some helpful information.
We really do appreciate you guys being here. And the one thing that I would like to say in closing too is that this is one of the most important things we do in school. We got to get this right. We appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for being here. We'll holler at you later.